Jedi Conclave, larger Jedi community, and the internet in general. My name is Patrick Gillespie. I go by Benjamin or Ben, however. And of course, those of you within the Conclave know me as Kelrax Lorcan. This video is one I've been meaning to do for a week on the subject of culture as it relates to Jediism. Without further ado, I'm going to get going. Forgive my perspective, I'm reading off another screen. Merriam-Webster defines culture as the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. Also, the characteristic features of everyday existence, such as diversions or a way of life, shared by people in a place or time. With that in mind, it becomes a little easier to discuss the concept of Jedi culture in a real-world context. Both existing elements and that which distinguishes us from mere fandom. So, let's go ahead and start with the obvious elements of culture that are already consistently present in Jediism. Belief in the Force, regardless of how one chooses to define it. The lightsaber as a general but highly recognizable symbol of Jediism. Meditation and study as a path to personal betterment. Meditation and study as a path to strengthening one's understanding of and or relationship to the Force. Belief that goodness, benevolence, and general concern for others is the natural state of human existence. Belief in self-determination. It is not the place of any Jedi to directly or indirectly determine the right path for another person. Orthopraxy, which is best defined as the insistence on taking sincere and decisive action, namely demonstrating one's faith and convictions, rather than simply saying what you're expected to say while not necessarily doing anything. Tolerance. Jedi, of course, of any temple or group, are discouraged to pass judgment on anyone unjustly, be it religion, nationality, age, sex, gender, ethnicity, orientation, etc., etc. These are all things that I have consistently seen from more than one Jedi community, thus I'm confident in identifying them as existing elements of our shared culture. There are also a number of areas where we can see a great deal of distinction, contributing to some cultural divergence. A good example would be the readily identifiable differences between the Temple of the Jedi Order and the Jedi Conclave. The core tenets of Tojo, I'll call them, are knowledge, focus, and wisdom, whereas the Conclave pillars are the Force, wisdom, and empathy. Furthermore, they adhere to different codes. Tojo attempting a more traditional or orthodox approach, professing a code identical to that of the Jedi of lore, the fiction that is. While the Conclave has worked out a code all their own. These distinctions speak directly to where each group feels their focus ought to be, and arguably creates within each group an effective subculture, not unlike the dynamic we see in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and even witchcraft. And still, within each group, there is a common thread, in line with adhering to self-determination, of individuality. While those within a given group will profess an agreement on the basics of the faith within the group, there are still a variety of interpretations within that group, creating the false sense of being disorganized or otherwise not united as a group. And yet, you don't, for the most part, see the groups fall apart completely as a result of infighting or ecumenical politics. I could be arguably accused of being dissatisfied with all this as it has developed thus far, as I have, in the past, at multiple points, attempted deliberate dissemination of ideas or concepts as ways to further the development of Jediism as possessed of a more distinct human culture, particularly in ways that are arguably superficial in hindsight, without deeper meaning attached to such practices. Examples of this consist of an attempt to artificially craft a non-English language, adopting Aurebesh and more recently Jedi runes and glyphs as a written language, at least when writing in my journal for religious study, and more than once introducing others to Poor Man's Pazak, a variant of the fictional card game that I'd adapted to be playable with standard playing cards. More successful efforts on my part, I'd argue as being more successful for being more sincere and less inclined for mere novelty, are such things as creating my own formal wear. I made my own tunic, tabard belt, and cloak. For days when I engage my faith more normally, such as more formally. I'm not starting this over again. Such as observed holidays for Jedi. I also, almost a year ago, began wearing learner's braid, often called a Padawan Braid, but as a visible way to display my part. Not to identify myself as an apprentice, I wasn't at the time that I started wearing this, but as a visible way to display my participation. This is not superficial either. The better known name for such braids is Trinity Braids, because it's 3 separate portions braided together. In my case, as a member of the Jedi Conclave, each strand of the braid corresponds to one of the 3 pillars. Those most basic tenets to us within the Conclave, belief in the Force and the practice of wisdom and empathy. The act of rebraiding in the process of personal grooming is also a way of reminding myself of the basics. In addition to this, I openly carry a lightsaber as a distinctly Jedi symbol, not unlike a crucifix or other readily identified religious artifacts, rather than a weapon. Important note. Then there's my more personal successes, which, if it's going to become a solid thing after I've returned to the Force, it'll by necessity develop more organically as I take on apprentices to whom I teach it, and so on down the line. I'm referring to my own interpretations of the Force and how to walk the Jedi path. The path of the navigator. The compass and the journey metaphor feature heavily... Brief interruption. So, the compass and the journey metaphor feature heavily in my interpretations and practices thus far, looking to the Force like magnetic north. And I think it has worked for me largely for not being forced, but coming to me as a sort of divine inspiration. It's genuine rather than artificial. Similarly, I frequently wear a pendant that is a real compass, and I learned how to use it properly. It's not a mere trinket to me, but a symbol from my path. For future, more organic efforts, if my son should choose choose to follow the Jedi path, I'll happily instruct and tutor him until such a time that he can legally join a temple. But regardless of that, I would insist on having for him a braiding day, to celebrate and see him off on the journey and ritualistically tie his first learner's braid, and make a point of teaching him how to do it himself, of course. When I attain knighthood, I intend to have for myself a cutting day, an observance of having advanced my dedication to the path and showing that dedication by removing the braid entirely, leaving a small undercut to be worn and maintained in the braid's place. I'll conclude that while many of us are content to wear the variety of available Jedi accoutrements, on occasion learn of and profess the faith, it's an eventuality that things such as what I have in mind will develop naturally and, given the widest possible reach afforded by operating and gathering via the internet, there is a great variety among us, and it will be quite a journey on its own to see how we eventually gel together to become more distinct as a group beyond our choice of lore. Whether we mean it to or not, we will become the change we wish to see, but it's not a destination in itself, but the journey that makes it happen. So, in exploring this, in a way I've simply come back to the basics, the starting point. It was not so much the question that changed as myself. I began at asking myself what makes us stand out, what makes us different from others. But now I realize the better question is, what brings us together? It's from that question, I think, that I can hope to achieve my goals of furthering Jedi culture. Not with superficially distancing ourselves, but through asking the questions, exploring, through genuine growth. So, what are all of your thoughts? Do you think I missed something? Do you have ideas that you find meaningful and wish to share with your peers? Well, don't be afraid to walk your path, friends. May the Force guide you.